How does childhood trauma impact a student's emotional regulation and behavior in the classroom, and how can teachers support them? By Olivia Nicol. Table of Contents. Section 1. How does childhood trauma affect development? Section 2. How does childhood trauma affect behavior and performance in the classroom? Section 3. What strategies can be implemented by teachers? And Section 4. Summary. Section 1. How does childhood trauma affect children's emotional and cognitive development? According to the National Institute of Mental Health, childhood trauma is defined as the experience of an event by a child that is emotionally painful or distressful, which often results in lasting mental and physical effects. Many traumatic events can result in the lasting impacts of childhood trauma, including accidents, bullying, death of a loved one, emotional abuse or neglect, sexual abuse, stress caused by poverty, and dysfunction in the child's house, including domestic violence, substance abuse, and a parent being incarcerated. How does trauma affect the brain? For teachers to learn how to help their students impacted by childhood trauma, it is essential to first understand how trauma impacts their students, because exposure to specific forms of complex trauma in childhood, including emotional, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, and witnessing family violence, have shown to have distinct effects on specific regions of the brain that are responsible for emotional and cognitive function. Trauma primarily disrupts two parts of the brain: the part responsible for cognitive functioning, the prefrontal cortex, and the part responsible for emotional regulation, the limbic system. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that is responsible for cognitive functions, including judgment, decision-making, and emotional behavior and regulation. The prefrontal cortex includes gray matter and white matter, both of which are essential properties within the brain. The gray matter, which includes the neurons, is the place where the processing of sensation, perception, voluntary movement, learning, speech, and cognition take place, whereas white matter's role is to provide communication between different gray matter areas and between gray matter and the rest of your body. However, research suggests that trauma to exposure may result in deficits of gray matter and white matter within the prefrontal cortex. The result of trauma causing deficits of gray and white matter causes cognitive processing changes within the prefrontal cortex. These cognitive changes are linked to results in problems with memory, planning, and decision-making in the children's development. Exposure to childhood trauma also affects the limbic system, the part of the brain that is responsible for attachment and regulating emotional responses. The amygdala, also known as the fear center, is a structure within the limbic system. In circumstances of a threat, our body utilizes the fear response center to either fight, flight, or freeze. The picture included in this slide helps to show how our body reacts when a threat is present. First, our body senses the threat. This threat information is then sent to the amygdala, responsible for emotional processing. The amygdala sends a distress signal to the hypothalamus, which is in control of fight, flight, or freeze response. The hypothalamus activates the sympathetic nervous system, which releases adrenaline. After adrenaline subsides, the hypothalamus activates to maintain regular release of cortisol, which is a stress response. Once the threat passes, cortisol levels fall and the parasympathetic nervous system is activated to reduce stress. However, when a child is living in an emotionally, verbally, and/or physically abusive home, their stress response system becomes disrupted as the amygdala is sent into constant overdrive, and in result, they have a highly oversensitive internal alarm system. An oversensitive internal alarm system can result in the child feeling stuck in survival mode, often causing overreactions to triggers in everyday things. It impacts their ability to manage strong emotions. The hippocampus, the area that stores and retrieves memories and distinguishes between past and present, is affected. And lastly, the prefrontal cortex is impacted by making it harder to concentrate, make decisions, and process information. Section 2. How does childhood trauma affect behavior and performance in the classroom? In the classroom, the effects of childhood trauma can manifest in several ways, specifically in the domains of behavior and learning. Understanding the ways in which trauma manifests in the classroom is important for teachers to be able to provide the emotional and academic supports in which they need. Children who have experienced trauma often develop behavioral coping mechanisms, such as externalizing or internalizing their behavior. Learning how to recognize when a child is using behavioral coping mechanisms is essential to keep from teachers misunderstanding the underlying reasons causing a child to have difficulties with learning, behavior, and relationships. Behavioral strategies are not only used to cope with emotional responses to stressors in the classroom environment, but also as a means to protect themselves when they mistakenly perceive the stressors as threats. A child externalizing behavior as a coping mechanism can look like bullying other students, aggression, and defiance. However, internalizing behavior in a classroom can look similar to anxiety, depression, and disassociation. However, it is important to understand that whether the child externalizes or internalizes their behavior, it is essential for teachers to be mindful because behavioral responses can lead to lost learning time and strained relationships with teachers and peers. Trauma can also impact many foundations for learning as the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex are affected from prolonged traumatic events. Therefore, children who have experienced childhood trauma often have trouble focusing, remembering, and staying engaged. Trauma can also have a bearing impact on the child's capacity to organize, plan, and reason. Tasks that require abstract reasoning, including math or comprehension, often are more difficult. However, it should be noted that difficulties in learning academic material can be further exacerbated by emotional stress, resulting in children acting out or disassociating. Section 3. What strategies can be implemented by teachers? Teachers play a critical role in supporting students affected by childhood trauma by creating a positive, safe, and accommodating classroom environment. And many approaches in the classroom can be used to help regulate children's emotions and behavior. One of the first strategies teachers should implement in consideration of having students who have faced childhood trauma is to create a safe and predictable environment. It is essential to recognize that the home life of children may not be a safe environment, and rather an environment where they are constantly in a state of fight, flight, or freeze. Teachers have the ability to help children impacted by trauma not only have a safe environment, but also help the children understand and know what a safe environment should look like. Teachers can also help students impacted by trauma regulate their emotions by reminding the class at the beginning of the day to anticipate the stressors. Teachers should indicate what the potential stressors could be throughout the day so that the students can plan on how they will react. Teachers should also avoid using disciplinary measures, such as deducting points, withdrawing privileges, and suspension, when a student acts up in class as a result of a behavioral coping mechanism. Instead, teachers should focus on helping the child name the emotion they are feeling to work towards expressing their emotions in a more appropriate way. Developmental trauma in children frequently involves the betrayal of trust from caregivers, making it then difficult for them to trust adults. Becoming a positive attachment for students by expressing warmth and joy in your students' accomplishments is essential to helping children who have experienced childhood trauma regulate their brain stress response system. Finally, strategies should also be implemented into your classroom to address the learning challenges for children faced by the impacts of childhood trauma. Differentiated instruction, such as flexible grouping, can be used to meet every child in their zone of proximal development. Practical strategies to implement within flexible grouping may include helping children to break down tasks into small, manageable steps, repeating information, and using scaffolding tasks by allowing children to work alongside their classmates. The results of childhood trauma are a significant yet commonly overlooked factor in children's development both cognitively and emotionally within the classroom. The effects of children experiencing traumatic events during childhood can disrupt the normal functioning of important brain regions, including the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. This disruption in the children's cognitive and emotional development can often manifest itself within the classroom as aggression, defiance, and disassociation. However, it is important to understand that unwanted classroom behavior may be the result of a behavior coping mechanism, a strategy used by children affected by trauma to protect themselves. Moreover, the implications of childhood trauma in children can result in learning challenges, affecting their memory and decision-making. It is vital that teachers implement appropriate strategies to help their students who have been affected by trauma, such as creating a safe environment and accommodating teaching. Understanding the implications of childhood trauma, how it can manifest in the classroom, and strategies for teaching is essential to be able to appropriately support students affected by trauma in your classroom. Thank you for listening to my presentation.